The first sign that something was wrong wasn't what she said, it was how quiet the house became after she arrived. The kind of quiet that hums under the surface, like the air itself is holding its breath. I didn't notice it right away. It crept in slow and polite the same way she did. My name's Haley, I'm 29 and 3 years ago, I let my mother-in-law move into our home because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought kindness was simple. You help someone in need, you open your door, you make space. I didn't realize that sometimes when you make space for someone they take the whole house. It began in early spring, right before everything started blooming again. My husband Mark called me at work. I remember because I was in the middle of a product meeting, my laptop covered in sticky notes, my brain halfway between deadlines and caffeine withdrawal. He said, "Mom's not doing great. Can we talk tonight?" And just like that, the day split in two before the call and after. At dinner that night he told me Linda's blood pressure had been acting up, her doctor recommended less stress, and she'd been having a hard time keeping up with the house. He said it so gently, like he was asking for a favor, not rewriting the next chapter of our lives. I nodded because that's what I do. I nod, I listen, I try to be fair. Mark and I had been married 4 years by then and we'd built a rhythm. Quiet mornings, shared playlists, inside jokes that made the world feel smaller in a good way. I didn't want to disturb that. So when he asked, would it be okay if she stayed with us for a little while? Just until she's back on her feet, I said yes before I even knew what that meant. I told myself it would be temporary. I told myself this was family. And when Linda moved in 2 weeks later with her boxes of floral china, a cedar chest that smelled like old perfume, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, I still believed I was doing something good. The first week was fine. She baked pies. She folded our laundry even when I told her not to. She'd say, "Oh honey, it's no trouble," with that soft laugh that always sounded rehearsed. Mark was happy. That mattered to me. But then little by little things began to shift. Not in obvious ways, but in those quiet rearrangements that only someone living inside the space would notice. He started moving things. First it was the spice rack. Then the dishes. Then one day I came home and the living room furniture had been rearranged. The couch was angled toward the window, not the TV. My throw blanket, the mustard one I loved, was gone. I asked about it. She smiled and said, "Oh, I thought it looked too bold for the room. Don't you think this feels calmer?" The way she said calmer made me feel like I was the chaos. Mark didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. He'd come home from work, see dinner on the table, hear his mom and me chatting and say, "Wow, you two are really getting along." And I'd smile because the truth, the tightness in my chest, the subtle corrections, the way my own house was starting to feel like a waiting room, didn't sound like something worth complaining about. But by the end of the first month I was whispering to myself in the shower just to feel like I still had a voice. The shift was subtle at first. Linda started telling stories about Mark's childhood, always highlighting the things she used to do better. "Oh, Mark loves his shirts folded a certain way, I used to do it like this." Or, "He's always been picky about seasoning. Let me show you the trick." She never said I was doing anything wrong, she just replaced my way with hers. And Mark, God love him, would just smile and say, "Mom knows me best." One night we were sitting at dinner and Linda brought up the idea of hiring a cleaning service. She said, "I think Haley has enough on her plate. I can tell the house stresses her out." The house, my house, stresses me out. I laughed it off, tried to make it sound like a joke, but she tilted her head, gave Mark that little look mothers give their sons and said, "See? Even now she's trying to keep the peace. She's too sweet to admit it." That was the first time I felt invisible. Because he didn't defend me, he just nodded. From then on I stopped trying to correct her. It wasn't worth the argument. But the thing about silence is, it doesn't protect you. It just builds a wall between what's real and what's being rewritten. Weeks passed. She started telling friends and relatives how she was helping out around the house. I'd overhear her on the phone saying things like, "Haley's still figuring things out. Bless her heart, she tries." That phrase, "bless her heart," sounds soft but it cuts like glass. It wasn't long before I started hearing things secondhand. A cousin called and said, "Linda told us you've been working too much, that the house is hard for you to manage." I didn't even know how to respond. I just stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my own reputation being rewritten by someone living down the hall. The real breaking point came one night after Mark and I had an argument. Not a big one, just one of those tired end-of-the-week misunderstandings. He'd forgotten to pick up groceries. I was exhausted and something small turned sharp. I remember saying, "You never listen when I tell you I'm overwhelmed." And he said, "You're not overwhelmed, you just make everything harder than it needs to be." That wasn't his voice. That was hers. I heard it the moment he said it. The phrasing, the tone, the way it made me sound unreasonable. I asked, "Did she tell you that?" He hesitated. And in that pause I knew. I slept on the couch that night. And the next morning Linda made me coffee. She placed the mug in front of me, sat down and said softly, "I know you love him. Can tell. But men don't respond well to confrontation, dear. You'll learn that with time." That word, dear, felt like a leash around my neck. After that, I started shrinking inside my own life. I'd wake up early just to avoid breakfast with her. I started eating lunch at my desk to delay coming home. Evenings became rehearsed. A smile, a nod, a good night. But there was one moment that still haunts me. A Sunday in June. We had family over for dinner and I was in the kitchen stirring something on the stove when Linda called out from the living room. "Oh, Haley's trying." I told her she'd get the hang of it eventually. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but my hand was shaking so bad the spoon clinked against the pot. Later that night, after everyone left, I went outside. Sat on the steps. The summer air was thick and sweet, but I couldn't breathe right. The porch light buzzed above me and I remember thinking, I don't know how to exist here anymore. Mark came out a few minutes later. He didn't sit beside me, just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking tired. He said, "Mom's trying, you know. She means well." And that's when I realized he couldn't see it. He couldn't see the way she rewrote moments, softened her voice, performed innocence so well that I looked like the problem for noticing. By the end of that summer I started feeling like a ghost in my own marriage. The house smelled like her perfume. The radio played her stations. The food tasted like her recipes. Even the dog started sleeping in her room. And somewhere in between trying to keep the peace and trying not to disappear, I lost the part of me that used to speak up. I used to have opinions. Now I had apologies. And still I told myself it was temporary. Because if I admitted how bad it really was, I'd have to face the possibility that kindness had led me straight into my own undoing. So I stayed quiet. For months. Until one night something finally cracked. Not loud, not explosive, but quiet. The kind of crack you don't notice until it's already too late. That was the night everything began to change. Part 2. It was a Thursday night when I realized I was starting to forget the sound of my own laughter. That might sound dramatic, but it's true. I'd hear myself in old videos on my phone, and it didn't even sound like me anymore. There was a looseness, a lightness I didn't recognize. Back then I laughed like I wasn't being watched. But in that house, in Linda's house, because that's what it had become, every emotion felt monitored. Even joy felt like it needed permission. Mark was traveling for work that week. It was supposed to be a small break for me, just a few quiet days to reset. But quiet isn't peace when someone's always listening. That night I came home from work late. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and pot roast. I walked in, set down my bag, and there she was, sitting at the table with a glass of wine, one eyebrow slightly raised as if she'd been waiting for me. "Long day?" she asked. I said, "Yeah," and started to walk past her, but she stopped me. "Haley," she said softly, "I know things have been tense. But you should really try to be more patient with Mark. He worries about you." I froze. Because I hadn't said anything to him about how I'd been feeling. Not recently. So how would she know there was anything to worry about? I remember forcing a smile. "Of course he worries. We're married." She sipped her wine, still watching me. "You know," she said, "he mentioned that sometimes you get overwhelmed. Maybe it's just too much right now." That word again. Overwhelmed. Her favorite diagnosis for me. I didn't argue. I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Instead, I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked fine, normal even. But there was something in my eyes I couldn't place. Like a faint cloud, always there, always spreading. That was the first night I cried without really knowing why. The next few weeks blurred together. Linda started spending more time in the kitchen, more time in Mark's ear. I could hear them sometimes, through the vent above our bedroom, her soft, low voice, his tired responses. Sometimes she'd say things like, "She just needs structure," or, "Don't take it personally, she's emotional." And he'd say, "Yeah, maybe you're right." I started to hate the sound of their laughter. Not because it was cruel but because it used to be ours. At work I started staying late on purpose. I volunteered for projects no one wanted. Anything to delay going home to that house that didn't feel like mine. I told myself I was being paranoid, that she meant well, that maybe I was too sensitive. But then small things started to disappear. Receipts, notes I left on the fridge, even my perfume bottle one day. When I asked, she'd tilt her head, look confused and say, "Oh, I haven't seen it. Maybe you misplaced it." Made me feel insane. She had this way of denying things so sweetly that I ended up apologizing for even asking. And every apology chipped a little more off the person I used to be. One evening while I was folding laundry in our room, I heard her on the phone downstairs. Her voice was hushed but I could make out fragments. "She's not herself lately. Poor Mark, he's doing his best. I'm just trying to keep things together." The way she said it, like she was the victim of my exhaustion, broke something inside me. That night when Mark came home I tried to bring it up. I said, "I think your mom's been talking about me." He sighed, ran his hand through his hair. "Haley, she's worried. She just wants peace in the house." Peace. That word felt like an accusation. I said, "There's no peace because she's making sure there isn't any." He shook his head, already done with the conversation before it even started. "You always think people are against you." And I wanted to scream, "People? She's not people, she's your mother. She's living in our house, she's changing everything." But I didn't scream. I just stood there, quiet again, the way I always am when I don't know how to win. By September I was sleeping in the guest room half the time. Not because we were fighting but because the tension had become physical, like humidity, thick and inescapable. Sometimes I'd hear Linda walking past the door at night, her slippers brushing the carpet. Once I caught her peeking in, just a shadow in the doorway. When I mentioned it to Mark, he said, "You're imagining things." Maybe I was. But the feeling stayed, like being observed, studied. The next morning I found one of my journals on the kitchen counter. It was open. I froze. Linda was at the sink, humming softly, like she hadn't just read pages of my private thoughts. I didn't say anything. Just picked it up and went upstairs, my hands shaking. That night I couldn't eat. Something in me shifted then, from hurt to something colder. It was around that time that my best friend, Jess, called. She'd noticed I'd been distant, that my texts had gotten shorter. She said, "You sound like you're living in someone else's skin." And I think that's the moment I realized I was. I told her what was happening and she said, "Haley, this isn't normal. She's manipulating you. She's controlling him." But I brushed it off. I said, "No, she's just old-fashioned." Just didn't buy it. Old-fashioned doesn't mean cruel. That stuck with me. Because I'd never used the word cruel before. Not even in my head. I started to notice more after that. The way Linda would step between us when Mark and I were talking. The way she'd interrupt, always gentle, always smiling but somehow erasing me from the frame. One night she brought up the idea of helping with the bills. I didn't understand at first. We were fine financially. But she said she'd noticed I'd been spending a lot lately, and maybe Mark should handle the budgeting for a while. He agreed. Just like that, I lost another piece of my autonomy. I remember walking into our bedroom that night, closing the door and feeling like the air had been vacuumed out. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Every decision, every conversation filtered through her. It's strange how control doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like kindness. Sometimes it sounds like concern. Things reached their lowest point on Thanksgiving. We were hosting. My parents were supposed to come, but my mom had the flu, so it ended up being just Linda's side of the family. People I barely knew. I spent 2 days cooking. The kitchen was chaos, but it felt good to do something. For once I wanted to feel capable again. That morning I woke up early, brushed my hair back, put on lipstick, told myself, "You can do this." When the guests arrived, Linda greeted them at the door like the queen of the house. She told everyone, "We've been so busy getting things ready. Mark and I have been cooking all morning." I froze in the kitchen doorway. She didn't even glance my way. Throughout dinner she kept the conversation moving. Stories, laughter, anecdotes about Mark's childhood, all of them starring her. And then near the end someone said, "Haley, you're so lucky to have such a close relationship with your mother-in-law." Linda smiled. That polite, knowing smile. "Oh, she tries," she said. "We have our little differences, but I'm patient." Everyone laughed. And I swear for a second the sound blurred. Like static in my head. I just stared at my plate, my pulse in my ears. Later that night after everyone left I asked her, quietly, why she said that. She looked at me, her face calm, and said, "Because it's true, dear. You do try. But not everyone is built for family." That sentence lodged itself in my chest like a splinter I couldn't remove. Mark walked in just as she said it and I thought, good, now he'll hear it. But she changed her tone instantly. She smiled sweetly and said, "We were just talking about how lucky we are to have each other." He smiled back. And I realized she didn't need to convince him. She just needed to control the narrative long enough for me to look unstable. That night when we went to bed he turned away from me. And in the dark I whispered, "You don't believe me anymore, do you?" He didn't answer. I think that silence hurt more than anything she ever said. By December something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not violently. Just quietly, like a branch under snow. I started keeping small bags packed. Not to leave, but because it made me feel like I still had a choice. I'd sit in my car sometimes in the driveway pretending to make phone calls just so I could breathe. I started therapy again. I didn't tell Mark. My therapist, Dr. Klein, said, "You're living in a constant state of gaslighting. That's psychological abuse, Haley." I remember staring at her, thinking, abuse? That word felt too big. Too ugly. But she explained it. The erosion of reality, the way my version of events was being replaced, rewritten, doubted. And for the first time in months I felt seen. So I went home that night. Because that's what you do when you're not ready to blow your life up yet. You go home. You survive the day. But things were changing. I started documenting. Texts, small comments, anything that could remind me later that I wasn't crazy. One evening Mark and I were in the kitchen when Linda came in holding one of my notebooks. She said, "I was looking for a recipe and found this. I didn't know you wrote down personal things." The tone was sharp now, colder. I said, "You went through my drawer." He smiled, almost proud. "You shouldn't hide things in a family home." Mark just stood there, torn between us. He said, "Mom, maybe you shouldn't have," but she cut him off. "If she has nothing to hide, why does it matter?" That was it. That was the moment something in me, the part that always wanted to make peace, finally broke. I said, "Because this isn't your home. It's mine." And she just looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then in the calmest voice imaginable she said, "It used to be. Before you forgot who built it." Mark shouted then, not at her but at me. "Why do you always have to turn everything into a fight?" And that's when I realized, she didn't just move into our house. She moved into his perception of me. That night I slept in the car. I parked a few blocks away, wrapped myself in a blanket, and listened to the rain tapping against the windshield. I thought about leaving, really leaving, but the idea felt too big, too final. So I just sat there until morning, watching the sky lighten, thinking about how easy it is to lose yourself in the name of being good. The next day when I came home the porch light was still on. Linda opened the door, her expression soft, rehearsed. "Rough night?" she asked. I walked past her without answering. And for the first time I noticed, the walls didn't feel heavy anymore. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was finally done carrying them. Because I knew something had to change. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But the version of me who kept apologizing was gone. And even though I didn't say it out loud, I could feel the words forming like a pulse under my skin. "You've taken everything from me. But I'm still here." There's this strange kind of calm that comes after you stop fighting to be believed. It's not peace, not really. It's more like surrender. Like your body gets tired of carrying the story around, trying to convince people it's real. That's where I was after that night in the car. Something inside me had gone still. Not numb. Just done. For the next few days I moved quietly through the house. I spoke only when necessary. Linda noticed, of course she did, and mistook it for guilt. She'd pass me in the hallway and smile like she'd won something. Maybe she had. Mark barely looked at me. We spoke through short, polite sentences. The kind you use with coworkers, not someone you once swore to build a life with. But silence can be clarifying. It's like fog lifting off a lake. Slowly, painfully, but once it clears you see everything for what it really is. I started seeing things differently. Not just her. Not just him. But myself. How many times I'd folded my instincts into smaller shapes to make room for everyone else. How many times I'd chosen to be understanding instead of honest. How many times I'd confused silence for grace. I used to think strength meant staying, holding on until things got better. Now I think strength sometimes means walking out before you disappear completely. The day it finally happened, it wasn't planned. It was a Tuesday, gray sky, light rain. I'd gone out to clear my head, just driving with no real direction, and somehow ended up in front of my friend Jess's apartment. She opened the door and took one look at me before saying, "You look like you've been holding your breath for months." I broke down right there in her doorway. Not the loud, cinematic kind of crying, the quiet, trembling kind that feels like it's leaking out of you from the inside. We sat on her couch for hours. I told her everything, every manipulation, every time I'd been made to feel small, every fight that wasn't really a fight but a performance staged by someone who knew how to look innocent. Jess didn't interrupt. He just listened. And then she said something that changed everything. She said, "Haley, you're waiting for him to see you. But maybe it's time you start seeing yourself again." That sentence stayed with me. I drove home that night feeling both terrified and strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've already lost the thing you were afraid to lose. When I walked in, Linda was in the living room watching TV. She looked up and smiled, that same sugar-coated smile. "Rough day, dear?" she asked. I didn't answer. I just went upstairs, grabbed a suitcase and started packing. Mark came home while I was folding clothes. He stood in the doorway, confused. "What are you doing?" I said, "I can't do this anymore." He blinked. "Do what?" "This. All of it. The house that didn't feel like mine. The marriage that felt like a performance. The way I had to prove my own version of reality every single day." He laughed once, not cruelly but nervously. "You're overreacting." I zipped the suitcase. The sound was final, sharp. I said, "That's what you've been telling me for months. Maybe I believed you for too long." Linda must have heard us because she appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Haley," she said softly, like she was comforting a child. "You'll regret making a scene." I looked at her for what felt like a long time, really looked. And I realized something: she needed me broken. That's how she stayed powerful. So I smiled, a real steady smile. And I said, "Then I guess I'll regret it somewhere else." I walked out with one bag. No big speech. No tears. Just the sound of rain on the roof as the door clicked shut behind me. The first few nights at Jess's place were rough. I kept waking up at odd hours, half expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway or her voice through the wall. Strange how even toxicity has a rhythm you get used to. But slowly something started to shift. I'd wake up and realize, no one was watching me. No one was rewriting my sentences mid-conversation. No one was correcting the way I existed. The silence felt different now. Not suffocating but open. Jess would make coffee in the mornings and we'd sit by her window watching traffic. I started talking again. Not small talk, real talk. About what I wanted, what I'd ignored, what I'd lost. For the first time in years, my words didn't echo back at me through someone else's version. I started journaling again. The first line I wrote was, "I'm allowed to take up space." Mark called after a few days. I didn't answer. He texted saying he wanted to talk. Then a few days later, another message. "Mom's gone back home." I realized I should have seen it sooner. I stared at that text for a long time. There was a time when those words would have made me rush back, hope rising, forgiveness already halfway formed. But something in me had changed. So I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I sat there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The loss, the exhaustion, but also the quiet dignity of finally choosing myself. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. And that was enough for now. A few weeks later, I met with Dr. Klein again. She said, "You sound lighter." And I said, "I'm not sure if I'm lighter or just less invisible." We talked about boundaries, about guilt, about how women are often taught to be peacekeepers even when it costs them their peace. She said, "You can love someone and still choose yourself." I didn't believe that before. Now I think it might be the truest thing I've ever heard. Spring came early that year. Jess and I planted small herbs in pots by her window. Basil, rosemary, thyme. The room started to smell alive again. I began to build routines. Little ones. Morning walks. Cooking for one without apologizing for it. Reconnecting with my sister who I'd barely spoken to in months. It wasn't a perfect comeback. Some days I missed Mark. Other days I felt furious at myself for missing him. Healing isn't neat. It loops and backtracks and surprises you on the days you think you're done. But there was progress. Real progress. One Saturday morning about 2 months after I left, I got a letter. Handwritten. From Linda. It said, "I hope you're doing better. Mark has been struggling without you. I'm sorry things became so difficult between us. I only wanted to help." There was no acknowledgement of what she'd done. No apology that held weight. Just a carefully curated version of events. One last attempt to control the narrative. I folded it up, placed it back in the envelope and threw it away. Not out of anger. Just acceptance. Some people will never see the damage they cause. Not because they can't, but because it keeps them comfortable not to. I can't make her see me. I can only make sure I see myself. About 6 months later, Mark and I met for coffee. He looked different, tired, older somehow. He said, "I didn't realize how much I let her get between us." I nodded. "I know." He looked down, hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry." And for the first time I believed him. Not because the words fixed anything, but because he finally looked like a man facing his own reflection without help from anyone else. We talked for an hour, not as a couple but as two people trying to understand the wreckage they'd survived. When we stood to leave, he said, "Do you think we could ever?" I stopped him gently. "I think we both need to learn how to be whole first." He nodded. And that was it. No dramatic goodbye. Just two people walking in opposite directions under a soft spring rain. These days my life is quieter. I still live with Jess for now. I still see my therapist. I still flinch sometimes when someone calls me dear. But there's laughter again, the real kind. The kind that sounds like me. I've started taking small trips alone. Bookstores, lakes, weekend drives. I even repainted an old dresser just because I liked the color. Tiny, ordinary joys that used to feel impossible. Sometimes I think about the house. That house that stopped feeling like home long before I left. I wonder if the walls still remember my silence. I wonder if Linda ever walks through it and feels the absence she created. But mostly I don't wonder anymore. Because that place isn't mine to fix. What's mine is this moment. The slow, imperfect rebuilding. There's one image that stays with me. The morning I left, when I drove away in the rain, the rearview mirror showed the house growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a turn. But the sound of the rain, steady, soft, cleansing, followed me all the way down the highway. And somewhere between one breath and the next I realized, that sound didn't mean ending. It meant renewal. Not a perfect life. Not a new beginning. Just another chance to breathe without asking permission. So that's where I am now, still healing, still learning, still human. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of it, it's this. You can lose almost everything. Your voice, your certainty, your sense of belonging. But if you can still find the courage to start again, even quietly, even imperfectly, then you haven't lost yourself. You've just begun to come home to who you were all along.